If you were a fan of video game and computer magazines in the late 80s and early 90s, you probably have at least heard of the Sharp X68000. The more fortunate among you may even have experience with the hardware itself. Originally released in 1987 in Japan, this home computer was built around the Motorola 68000 CPU and some pretty impressive graphics and sound hardware backing it up. There were a number of upgrades available for it over the course of its life, including more RAM, external hard drives, faster CPUs, and MIDI sound modules being just a few of those. Its games would come primarily on 5 1/4-inch floppy disks, and would often require you to use multiple disks and even disk swapping while you were playing. Of course, with great power and expandability comes a premium, and the Sharp X68000 was a costly beast. Even entry-level packages were thousands of dollars, with even more robust packages thousands more. This didn't stop some of Japan's biggest software makers from supporting the device, however. Some of the industry's most prolific software makers at the time brought out many of their best games and IPs. Capcom in particular heavily supported the X68000, bringing hits like Strider, Street Fighter II, and Final Fight home nearly perfectly on it. They even used it as a development tool for their arcade games, a testament to the versatility and power of the hardware. Smitten with the idea of owning one years ago, I set out to collect games and hardware for it. I quickly realized that it was a fruitless endeavor, with prices, rarity, and hardware problems being a big headache. I still got the chance to play some pretty good games during that time, finally understanding just how awesome this thing was. For all intents and purposes, it was sort of the Neo Geo of home computers at the time. It had the best versions of many arcade games for years, and wouldn't really be eclipsed in power until the 32-bit systems showed up. While Sega didn't make games themselves for the X68000, they did license out some of their wares to other companies. To my knowledge, 8 Sega properties made their way to the X68000, and we are going to take a look at all of them here. The classic superscaler Afterburner II made its way onto the X68000 in 1989, courtesy of DEMPA. Despite having no custom hardware for sprite scaling, this one does a hell of a job recreating it. It isn't as fast, nor does it have as much on screen as the arcade, but it does a great job with what it's doing. It's colorful, controls well with the mouse, and does a decent job of recreating the arcade game's music. Compared to its console contemporaries, it's by far the best version of this game. We really wouldn't see its better until the 32X version showed up many years later. In 1992, DEMPA would also release a port of the Sega arcade classic Alien Syndrome. Up until this point, we had seen this one on the likes of the Sega Master System, the NES, and even the Game Gear. But what the X68000 did was bring it home just about as arcade perfect as you could get. The colorful, well-animated sprites are represented very close to the source material, with boss creatures filling the screen. If you were disappointed with the muted port that the Sega Master System saw, this will likely blow you away. I have found no less than 3 versions of columns for the X68000, in what appears to be by 3 different companies. The best of these was released in 1991 by System Soft. It looks the best, has the most options and game modes, and even has some decent music. Other than that, it's columns, so you know exactly what you're going to get. In 1989, DIMPA would again answer the call for Sega ports on the X68000, with their absolutely sublime rendition of the classic multi-directional shoot-'em-up, Fantasy Zone. If you guys have ever seen this in the arcade, you know what you are seeing here is damn near perfect. The incredible color, the parallax scrolling, the animation, it's all there. There are even some exclusive stages not seen in other versions of the game. I really enjoyed this port and honestly do not feel it was eclipsed until the Sega Ages Saturn edition made its way home. One of the first Sega games DIMPA would bring to the X68000 was 1987's Space Harrier. This version of the game was particularly impressive given its proximity to the arcade release. It's actually pretty similar to their Afterburner II effort. It wasn't quite as fast or have as much on screen as the arcade, but it did have incredibly impressive color use, smooth software sprite scaling, and some damn solid music. It supports multiple controllers for the X68000, and the gameplay is spot on. Considering that Sega sprite scaling arcade boards were incredibly customized tech in the mid-80s, this port is actually pretty amazing. Again, it would be years before a home version would eclipse it, proving once again that the X68000 was truly ahead of its time. Sharp would step into software distribution themselves with 1989's Super Hang-On. Developed by SPS, this one is remarkably close to the Genesis and Mega Drive editions of the game. It's a little faster, has more on-screen detail, and the software-based sprite scaling appears a bit smoother. I love the soundtrack to this game, and the X68000 does it justice here. There's no denying the Genesis and Mega Drive version of this game was pretty solid, but the X68000 edition here trumps it in nearly every category. This should be the case given the cost difference between the two platforms, but you still can't help but be impressed by what's happening here. Some of you may recall me being a big fan of Thunderblade in the arcade, and man was I blown away by what the X68000 was able to do with it. Stepping up again was Sharp and SPS, releasing this one in 1990. The sprite scaling here is damn near as good as the arcade. It doesn't put as much on screen and isn't quite as smooth, but you get that same great feeling of moving in 3D, and it's as hectic as it ever was. The only problem I found with this was the control, which seemed to be tailored to an analog speed adjustment. The digital buttons only allowed you to control speed either going full speed with the button pressed or slowing down by letting off of it. This made the game hard as hell and incredibly frustrating. It may have been an error on my part, but I just could not find a way to get around it. Even so, you just have to love the visual presentation and polish of this. It really showed off the power of the X68000. Our last game is Bonanza Bros. It was based on the arcade edition of the game, with Sharp and SPS again stepping up to release this one in 1991. While it isn't among my Sega favorites, I still enjoyed how well the X68000 handled it. Just as colorful and well animated as that version, it even retains the FBI "winners don't use drugs" screen. I could get every single one of these Sega releases to run on the base X68000 hardware spec released in 1987, but this one. I had to increase the amount of system RAM before it would boot properly. This could be due to its later release, as many Capcom games required RAM upgrades as well. If you were a fan of this arcade, you'll love this version. Collecting for the X68000 today has become a big money investment. Complete units of even the old base models are pretty expensive, and software often costs in the hundreds for anything of substance. But you can't deny the incredible legacy of the device, being home to a great many arcade port that were quite simply the best around. There are a few emulators out there that do a fair job of recreating the X68000 experience, though some of them can be tough to set up and get running correctly. If you ever get that wild hair and want to give it a go, you'll find a piece of hardware that was truly ahead of its time. I'm really glad that Sega's properties were well represented on it. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.